Welcome to MarketTamer.com. Over the past year and a half, a lot of blame has been directed towards the regulatory authorities, and with good reason. But if we take a look at this overview slide, we can see one of the limitations that the regulators have been faced with, which is reach and lack of centralization of power, in the sense that if we take a look at, for example, a thrift is overseen by individual states, by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, as well as the Office of Thrift Supervision. Now, if we take a look at insurance companies, credit unions, bank holding companies, commercial banks, and so forth, the challenge has been for regulators that they have been trying to keep up with some of the more complex and exotic instruments. For example, many of these companies had the choice based on a legal loophole to actually choose the regulator. So if you think about it, if you're a company that's specializing in some exotic off-balance sheet instruments that are difficult to distill, difficult to understand, maybe they've been securitized, passed on from one company to another, for example, perhaps to an investment bank, the cash flows have been sliced up, they've been classified as different ratings, maybe a grade A, grade B, grade C, or AAA, AA, whatever you want to call it. And all of these cash flows have been sliced up such that the original assets are very far in terms of distance from the securitized vehicles which have been visible to investors. Well, when asset values get separated from the vehicles, whether it be the structured investment vehicle or whether we're looking at securitized vehicles and we're looking at maybe sliced up cash flows, the challenge then is that transparency is almost impossible for the regulators. And so what we see is that they have limited reach as it stands based on this balkanization. But beyond that, when companies choose their own regulator, then it becomes almost impossible for them to actually fully regulate and do their jobs well, because they don't actually have the sophistication to understand what is a collateralized debt obligation and how does that pass through to an investment bank, and then how does that pass through to another vehicle such that it is subsequently sold to the public, and the cash flows are divided out based on gradations, and it becomes incredibly hard. In fact, Warren Buffett stated that some of these CDOs had over 1,000 pages of content and were virtually impossible to separate and to understand. Now, if that's Warren Buffett having a challenge understanding valuation, you know that somebody who is perhaps less sophisticated at one of the regulatory bodies was definitely facing an uphill battle. And so that's one of the reasons why regulatory reform is strongly encouraged, and we should see in the next couple of years that if there's centralization, that we should see a mitigation of future bubbles based on greater regulatory control. But the problem with regulatory control is that it's always playing catch up. Obviously, new instruments will always be designed, they will always be pitched and sold, and in the search for greater returns, it's always going to be a challenge for investors to find greater returns, and as a result, it's going to always be a challenge for regulators to try and dissect the new instruments and exert control and authority as would be anticipated or expected. So with that, hopefully that gives you a quick overview of why the regulatory system is so difficult in the US and why some changes, certainly in our view, are encouraged and needed.